Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be guiding you through today's story. This is a completely human written work of science fiction, so relax, clear your mind, and let's dive right in.
The imperial chamber stretched 3 stories high, walls of polished obsidian reflecting the geometric light patterns that fell like spears across the floor. Liabeth stood motionless on her dais, her silver hair cascading past shoulders, draped in wine-red silk adorned with gold thread that traced patterns of conquered territories. The burgundy horns curving from her temples caught the light, symbols of her dominion, unmistakable as a crown. Her crimson skin held the undertone of dried blood, natural and deliberate, a warning written into her very biology. 67 systems knelt before her annually. 43 had learned the price of refusal. The envoy from the human colony approached with the measured gait of someone carrying either a final peace offering or a death sentence. Behind him, guards flanked a man in tactical black, the tribute. Liabeth had demanded representatives from every conquered territory. The humans had sent this one, this Kenneth, presented with standard protocols. Restrained but not shackled, clothed but unadorned, alive but aware of his expendability. She noted the details that mattered. His olive skin bore no ceremonial markings, no supplicant's paint. His dark hair lay in practical simplicity, untouched by oils or ornaments. He stood with the posture of someone assessing a room's exits and structural integrity rather than absorbing the weight of imperial presence. His eyes moved across the chamber with the cold methodology of a hunter surveying terrain. The envoy bowed until his forehead nearly touched the floor. The human colony presents tribute to the Empress of the Eternal Dominion, she who has bent the stars themselves to her will. Kenneth didn't bow. He stood, arms loose at his sides, and something in the Imperial Guard shifted, a ripple of tension that ran through the assembled court like a blade through silk. The envoy's voice cracked slightly, but he continued, his desperation rising with each stuttered honorific. Liabeth's stillness became absolute. She had not survived 4 centuries of conquest through passive observation. She had not maintained her empire through tolerance. She had not become the nightmare that civilizations whispered about in their darkest spaces by accepting disrespect. She descended from her dais, and the court held its breath. Each step echoed against the obsidian floor, a sound calculated to deepen fear. Her robes trailed behind her like the shadow of something far larger than herself, something that had devoured 1,000 worlds and was still hungry. She moved until she stood directly before him, and even then Kenneth did not lower his gaze. "You do not kneel," she said. Her voice carried the resonance of someone accustomed to obedience, each word chosen with the precision of an executioner's blade. "No," Kenneth replied. "Simple, factual, not defiant, worse, indifferent." The guards moved forward in synchronized motion, but Liabeth raised her hand. Her fingers were long, elegant, tipped with nails that had drawn blood from beings far larger than this human. She studied him with the intensity of a physicist examining a phenomenon that violated known laws. "You understand who stands before you." Kenneth's jaw tightened slightly, the first genuine reaction she had observed. The Empress. Terror of the outer reaches. Woman who executes colonies for insufficient tribute. Woman who dismantled the Therion Collective for refusing to acknowledge her supremacy. "Yet you do not fear," she said. It was not a question. "No," Kenneth said, and his voice carried something she had encountered nowhere else in her life. Not confidence, because confidence implied the possibility of defeat. This was something deeper, a certainty that existed independent of circumstance. "I'm not scared of you." The words hung in the chamber like a thrown blade, rotating slowly, visible to everyone. The guards stiffened. The envoy made a sound like a trapped animal. The assembled nobles and commanders seemed to collectively hold a breath they could not release. Liabeth felt something shift in her chest, a sensation unfamiliar enough to be dangerous. Her hand rose. For one moment, the human's eyes flickered down to her fingers, assessing the threat. She could terminate him with a gesture. She had terminated thousands with less provocation. Instead, she turned back to her dais, and her voice emerged colder than the vacuum of space. "Remove the envoy. The colony's next tribute will be better prepared." She settled back onto her throne, and her eyes never left Kenneth. "This one remains. Palace rotation. Place him in the residential wing. He is not to be harmed. A pause, weighted with menace. Yet, as the guards escorted the envoy toward the exit, Kenneth stood unmoved, still meeting her gaze across the impossible distance of the chamber. Liabeth had conquered worlds with that stare. She had made species reconsider their existence with nothing but the weight of her attention. This man stood as though he were cataloging her defenses. The residential wing had been built to accommodate tributes of various physiologies: pressure chambers for the methane breathers, thermal pools for the crystalline entities, standard atmospheric cells for carbon-based life. Liabeth had ensured the human suite was adequate. Adequate was what the defeated received. Adequacy was itself a mercy. She discovered him in the observation garden at 0400 station time, when the artificial sunlight had been dimmed to simulate the sleep cycle of her home world. He stood before the viewport that overlooked the docking bays, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the configuration of ships with the meticulous attention of someone performing calculations. "You should be resting," she said. The statement contained no warmth, no suggestion. It was simply what she had decided. Kenneth turned without the startled response of someone caught. His dark eyes reflected the amber glow of the planet below them. "Your gravity is 30% higher than Earth standard." Took a while to adjust to the muscle fatigue. Movement helps. She moved closer, and his jaw tensed again. That micro-reaction that suggested his calm was a construct carefully maintained. "You have access to the recreation facilities, the combat chambers, the medical suite, though I find it difficult to imagine what you would require treatment for." "I'm human," Kenneth said, turning back to the viewport. "We break easy and heal slow. We're soft compared to most species you've conquered. That's why you're probably wondering why I'm not terrified." "I am." She stopped beside him, close enough to feel the temperature differential his body created against her cooler exterior. "Curiosity is the only reason you still draw breath." Kenneth exhaled slowly. "The Empress of Eternal Dominion experiences curiosity. That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered the question as though it deserved more than a dismissal. Rage, the kind that comes from power that's never been questioned, or boredom, that you'd kill me because you'd tired of the game before it started. "Perhaps I will," Liabeth said, and it was not a threat. It was a possibility, open and honest, like discussing weather. "Maybe," Kenneth said. "But you brought me to the observation garden at 4 a.m. instead of your execution chamber. You ordered your guards not to harm me. You put me in the residential wing instead of a containment cell." He finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression that resembled kindness, which was absurd, and therefore deeply troubling. "I think you're wondering what I saw when I didn't look at you, like you were a god." Liabeth's hand moved before she could consider the action, her fingers brushing the curve of his jaw, a touch that could have been a caress or the prelude to his death. Kenneth remained still, breathing, his pulse visible against the column of his throat. "Do not presume to understand me, human." "Wouldn't dream of it," Kenneth said, and his voice had deepened into something that resembled amusement. "But I understand what it's like to have power and have it mean nothing. I understand what it's like to stand at the top of something and feel alone." Her hand withdrew. She should have killed him for the presumption. Instead, she found herself walking away, her robes trailing across the polished floor, and her final words carried a weight that surprised them both. "Rest, Kenneth. Tomorrow you meet the High Command." Behind her, she heard him exhale, a release of tension she had not consciously been causing. When she reached the corridor's bend, she stopped, her hand pressed against the cold wall, and wondered when exactly curiosity had evolved into something that terrified her more than any military threat. The High Command had not seen her hesitate in 40 years. The war room existed 3 levels below the Imperial residence, carved from living stone and reinforced with alloys that could withstand planetary bombardment. Liabeth had designed the specifications herself, a space where power could be discussed with brutal honesty. 17 chairs surrounded the hexagonal table. Kenneth stood at its center like a specimen on display. Commander Tresh, whose species had nearly crushed humanity twice before diplomatic negotiations, studied the human with the skepticism of someone accustomed to analyzing threats. The Empress presents a Deathworlder to the High Command with no explanation, no security briefing, no tactical assessment. The assessment stands, Liabeth said. She had positioned herself at the table's head, but her attention kept slipping toward Kenneth, which was precisely the kind of liability that destroyed empires. He remains. On what authority? Tresh leaned forward and his carapace shifted with barely contained rage. The human colonies have shown no improvement in resource allocation, no advancement in technical capability, no strategic value whatsoever. They are negligible. Kenneth's voice cut across the tension with the precision of a blade. The Therion Collective wasn't negligible when they had a naval advantage. The Empress still dismantled them. Every consciousness in the chamber turned toward him. Speaking in the war room without invitation violated 17 ceremonial protocols. Addressing a high commander without deference was tantamount to declaring war. Liabeth felt something unfamiliar kindle in her chest, not rage, but something adjacent. Ownership, perhaps. Protection of something that could hurt her. The human speaks out of turn, Tresh said, and his voice carried the weight of someone preparing to issue an execution order. This is the second transgression against Imperial protocol. Surely even the Empress recognizes the necessity of discipline. Kenneth turned to face Tresh directly, and his demeanor shifted in a way Liabeth had not witnessed until that moment. The casual indifference evaporated. In its place emerged someone who had been trained in violence, who had likely engaged in it, who understood the precise calculus of how to break a body or a will. The Therion Collective fell because they assumed their advantage was permanent. They didn't account for an opponent who could adapt faster. They built their fleet to their own specifications and never considered how someone with nothing to lose would fight. "You are insignificant," Tresh said, but his tone had shifted slightly. Liabeth recognized the micro-adjustment, the moment a predator realized the prey might have teeth. "I'm alive in a room where I shouldn't be," Kenneth said. "I'm speaking when protocol says I should be silent. I walked past 4 generations of your evolutionary advancement and didn't blink. That either makes me very stupid or very dangerous." He paused. The Empress is trying to determine which. Liabeth felt her heart rate accelerate, a purely physical response that she should not be experiencing in the war room. She should execute him. The High Command was watching, assessing whether her judgment had been compromised. She was the Empress of the Eternal Dominion, and she did not hesitate. She did not explain. She did not defend her decisions to anyone. "Remove the High Command," she said. Empress, Tresh began, his voice carrying careful objection. Now, the dismissal was absolute. Within moments, the war room held only the two of them, and the weight of decisions that would reshape empires. Kenneth stood perfectly still, his expression neutral, his breathing controlled, and Liabeth moved toward him with the deliberate grace of a predator that had forgotten it was being observed. "You are either the most intelligent human I have encountered," she said, her voice dropping into a register that usually preceded deletion from the universe, "or the most suicidal. I have not yet determined which will prove true." "Then keep me alive long enough to find out," Kenneth said. His eyes held her gaze with a steadiness that should have been unreal. "Your command has fear written across every response they gave. They questioned your judgment, your loyalty, your strategic capability. I've been here 3 hours and I'm already more useful than any of them." She reached out and drew her fingers along the line of his jaw, a touch that contained the possibility of violence and the promise of something she could not yet articulate. "And if I decide you are simply an amusing anomaly, that your value expires the moment I grow tired of the novelty?" Kenneth tilted his head slightly, increasing the pressure of her touch against his skin. "Then I'll die knowing I broke the pattern of a 400-year empire just by walking into a room and refusing to kneel." 3 weeks into Kenneth's presence at the Imperial Palace, Liabeth discovered the truth that would unravel her certainties and rebuild them into something far more dangerous. The revelation came through the intelligence division, though not through any interrogation technique she employed. Instead, her analysts found themselves tracing communications Kenneth had received before his arrival, transmissions routed through 17 relay systems, encrypted with protocols the human should not have possessed, containing specifications for the precise location of her weapons facility on Sector 7. The most heavily fortified installation in the Dominion, the installation that housed the Singularity device. Liabeth did not have him arrested. She did not execute him. Instead, she waited until the night shift had cycled through the palace, until her chambers stood empty except for the artificial sounds of the environmental systems, and then she found him in the observation garden where this had begun. Kenneth knew before she spoke. She could see it in the way his body adjusted, the tension that flooded his muscles, the calculation that shifted behind his eyes. "You were sent to destroy the Singularity device," Liabeth said. There was no accusation in her voice. There was nothing at all. "You were a saboteur, trained and equipped. Your primary objective was to cripple my war capability. Your secondary objective was assassination." Kenneth did not deny it, yes. The honesty was somehow more cutting than any lie could have been. It crystallized the past 3 weeks into a different shape, where every moment of connection was leverage, where every night he had stood in this garden studying her docking patterns and defense positions was reconnaissance. "Yet you remain," Liabeth continued. "You have not attempted the mission. You have not made contact with your handlers. You had the opportunity twice, 3 times if you account for the maintenance conduit that feeds directly to Sector 7. "Yes," Kenneth said again. "Why?" The question emerged with a rawness she had not permitted in her voice for centuries. "Why not complete your assignment? Why not neutralize me and save your species from extinction?" Kenneth turned to face her, and his eyes held something that resembled grief. "Because the human colonies wouldn't survive the retaliation. Because the moment I triggered any explosion in that facility, you would execute every settlement on the fringe worlds. Because I realized 3 weeks ago, standing in this exact spot with your hand on my face, that you were more afraid of what I represented than any weapon we could possibly build." He stepped closer, and she did not retreat. "The saboteur I was supposed to be is dead. I killed him the moment I refused to kneel." Liabeth's hand rose, and Kenneth closed his eyes, accepting whatever came next. But she did not strike him. Instead, her fingers traced the path from his temple to his jaw with the delicate precision of someone handling something irreplaceable. "If I execute you now, it appears as weakness. It appears as though you turned me from my purpose. The High Command will interpret this as corruption, and they will move against me." "I know," Kenneth said quietly. "If I allow you to live, I validate your insubordination. I place the needs of a single human above the stability of an empire that took me 4 centuries to construct." "I know that too," Kenneth said, "but you're not going to execute me, and you're not going to send me away. Because, for the first time in 400 years, you met someone who didn't look at you and see the Empress. Someone who looked and saw a woman, and you can't unsee that now." She wanted to hate him for the accuracy of it. She wanted to destroy him for making her vulnerable to something as chaotic and uncontrollable as desire. Instead, she kissed him with the intensity of someone who had spent centuries conquering the universe and discovering it had all been preparation for this, for the moment she would lose complete control and find it more exhilarating than absolute power. The political crisis erupted with the precision of a tactical strike. Within 48 hours of the revelation regarding Kenneth's origins, 3 High Command members had filed formal objections to his continued presence. Commander Tresh had explicitly declared it a matter of imperial security. The governing councils of 2 allied species threatened to withdraw support unless the human saboteur was executed immediately. Liabeth scheduled a public tribunal. Kenneth stood in the central court of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by holographic projections displaying his encrypted communications, his sabotage training records, his explicit mission parameters. He stood with the same calm he had demonstrated in her presence, unafraid and unbowed, which somehow made the entire proceeding more theatrical and therefore more political. Liabeth sat upon her throne, elevated above the proceedings, her expression carved into something resembling indifference. But Kenneth could read her now. He could see the tension in how her fingers gripped the armrest, could track the moment her gaze flickered toward him when Tresh made the motion for immediate execution. The evidence of sabotage is irrefutable, the tribunal's magistrate declared. She was an ancient entity whose species had nearly driven itself to extinction before Liabeth's conquest, and she spoke with the careful neutrality of someone reading from predetermined conclusions. The question remains, why was this human not eliminated upon discovery? The chamber fell silent. This was the moment. The moment where Liabeth would either defend her decision and risk appearing compromised, or accept the verdict and execute Kenneth publicly, ensuring no further questions about her judgment. Instead, Kenneth spoke. Because, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the clarity of someone who had been trained in public address, I represent something the Empress has never encountered. Not a threat to her power. A mirror to it. Silence, Tresh commanded. But Liabeth raised her hand, let him speak. Kenneth turned to address the tribunal, though his attention remained partially on the Empress. 400 years of conquest. 400 years of every species in this dominion viewing her as a god to worship or a disaster to flee. 400 years of being alone at the top because everyone below her is terrified. He paused. The sabotage mission failed because the saboteur realized that the greatest threat to the Empress wasn't military force, it was connection. This is irrelevant to the security question, Tresh said. It's absolutely relevant, Kenneth continued, because the Empress kept me alive not out of weakness, but out of strategic genius. She realized that an empire held together purely by fear is fragile. It fractures the moment the fear becomes secondary to something stronger. Liabeth leaned forward on her throne, and the gesture silenced the chamber more effectively than any declaration could have. The human, she said, her voice carrying absolute authority, is correct. I kept him alive because his resistance to my power demonstrates a capability the outer territories could acquire. I kept him alive to understand how a species could maintain dignity under dominion. I kept him alive because strategic interest transcends execution protocols. She paused, and the weight of that pause was devastating. The tribunal votes now. Execute the human and watch your territories become restless with the knowledge that Empress Liabeth fears their independence, or recognize his value and watch them stabilize under the understanding that even within the Dominion, growth is possible. The vote was 6-3 for execution. Liabeth stood, and her robe seemed to expand around her like the shadow of something vast and ancient and infinitely patient. The tribunal's verdict is noted and disregarded. The human remains in my custody under imperial protection. This is not subject to further debate. As the magistrate attempted to speak, a security alert cascaded through the chamber's communication systems. One of the 3 counselors who had voted for execution had just died in his residence. A systems failure in his life support, completely accidental, completely convenient. Commander Tresh's face shifted from rage to calculation to acceptance. The message had been delivered. You question me, you disappear. As the tribunal dissolved in chaos, Kenneth and Liabeth's eyes met across the chamber, and they both understood that something irreversible had occurred. She had chosen him over the institution. That choice, once made, could never be unmade. The attack came from the Vrex Collective, a faction that had chafed under Dominion control for 3 decades. They coordinated a strike against the Imperial Palace with a precision that suggested assistance from internal dissidents, likely Tresh and his allies, attempting to destabilize Liabeth's position by forcing a military crisis she could not control. Kenneth learned about it from the alarms that suddenly flooded the palace corridors. Liabeth had positioned him in her war room, a deliberate statement that he was now part of her inner council, part of her defense apparatus. When the station shook from the impact of the first assault, Kenneth assessed the tactical displays with the clinical precision of someone who had been trained in military strategy. They're not attacking the palace directly, he said, his eyes tracking the Vrex assault patterns. They're striking the reactor core beneath Sector 4. If that fails, the station's environmental systems become compromised. You lose structural integrity in 60 minutes. The High Command commanders stared at him, then at Liabeth, seeking confirmation that they should trust a human's tactical assessment. "He is correct," she said. "The Vrex will create a catastrophic scenario where I must choose between defending the palace or stabilizing the station. Either choice damages my authority." "We can dispatch the defense array to hold them at Sector 4, one commander suggested. Kenneth shook his head. "That's what they expect. They're already monitoring for defensive reinforcement. The moment you commit forces, their secondary strike hits the command center from below. You lose communication and coordination. You lose the war." He pointed to the holographic display, tracing routes through the palace's underlying infrastructure that none of the military analysts had immediately identified. "Send a minimal force to Sector 4 as distraction. But I can access the reactor directly through the maintenance systems. If I can reach the core before the structural breach becomes critical, I can stabilize the containment sequence." "That route passes through 3 compartments currently exposed to vacuum," Tresh said. And there was something resembling satisfaction in his voice. A human cannot survive such conditions. Kenneth was already moving toward the exit. "Give me 45 minutes. "Kenneth," Liabeth said, and something in her voice made him stop. When he turned, she was descending from her command station, crossing the war room with the grace of a predator. She reached him and kissed him with a ferocity that contained desperation, a woman who had never before experienced the prospect of losing something irreplaceable. "Come back," she said against his mouth. "That is not a request. That is an imperial command." "I hear you," Kenneth said, and he moved with purpose toward the maintenance access. The next 40 minutes were compressed into a series of sensory shocks: the depressurization of the first compartment, the explosive force of escaping atmosphere that Kenneth had prepared for by tethering himself to the infrastructure. The second compartment held the bodies of 3 maintenance workers who had died attempting the same procedure. The third compartment was the one that nearly killed him. The structural breach was wider than the tactical data had indicated, and the radiation exposure from the reactor core was significant enough to cause cellular damage that would take months to recover from. Kenneth reached the control panel and began inputting the containment sequence with fingers that had begun to shake from exposure. His vision blurred. His skin felt like it was burning from the inside. He completed the sequence just as the containment field surged back to full stability, and then there was no time for anything but the journey back through vacuum and depressurization chambers, through compartments that were repressurizing and filling with toxic atmosphere, through corridors where his consciousness threatened to fracture. He collapsed 3 meters from the war room entrance. Kenneth woke to Liabeth's hand on his chest, her touch gentle in a way that suggested a carefully modulated pressure to verify his heartbeat's continued function. The medical chamber was automated, but she was present, which meant she had not left his side during the 36 hours his body had required to stabilize from the radiation exposure. "You're awake," she said, and the relief in her voice contradicted the millennia of careful emotional control she had spent decades perfecting. Kenneth tried to speak. His throat felt like it had been coated with abrasives and exposed to open flame. Liabeth appeared to understand this, because she brought water to his lips with the patience of someone who had never before performed such a task, and therefore approached it with the precision of someone handling something sacred. "The reactor," he managed. "Stabilized completely," she confirmed. "The Vrex Collective's secondary strike hit the command center 16 minutes after you reached the containment core. The automatic defenses held. The defense array routed forces through the routes you identified before leaving the war room." She paused, her finger tracing the line from his sternum to his collarbone. "You predicted the tactical situation so accurately that Tresh attempted to suggest you had coordinated the attack directly, that you were a saboteur who had accelerated his timeline." "Did anyone believe him?" Kenneth asked. "No," Liabeth said simply, "because you nearly died preventing the catastrophe he claimed you orchestrated. Even Tresh recognized the absurdity. Her hand moved to his face, and her expression shifted into something that contained vulnerability. "You exposed yourself to lethal radiation. You accepted termination risk to save my station." Kenneth closed his eyes, processing the sensation of her touch against his healing skin. "I saved the station to save you. There's a difference." "There is," Liabeth agreed, and her voice had shifted into the intimate register she used only when they were completely alone. "And it changes everything." She leaned down and kissed him with a tenderness that was somehow more devastating than her previous intensity. This kiss contained acceptance. It contained the acknowledgement that she was choosing this. Choosing him. Knowing the political cost, knowing the military risk, knowing that her authority would be questioned in ways it had not been in 4 centuries. Kenneth reached up and pulled her closer, ignoring the pain in muscles that were still recovering from radiation exposure, and when she shifted to straddle him carefully, her weight balanced so she did not aggravate his injuries, he felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of power dynamics. For so long, she had been the apex, the one who conquered, the one who controlled. But here, in the medical chamber, with her silver hair falling around them like water, with her crimson skin shadowing his olive tones, she allowed him to direct the pace. She allowed him to choose how deep the kiss became, how far her hands explored his healing body, how much vulnerability she would permit herself to demonstrate. Her robes fell away, and beneath them was not the armor she wore in the war room, but a body as susceptible to desire and touch and connection as any human. The burgundy tone of her skin deepened where blood rushed beneath the surface, where pleasure made her lose the careful control that governed every other aspect of her existence. "I thought I had lost you," she whispered against his neck, and Kenneth understood that she was not speaking in abstracts. She was speaking from a specific terror, the knowledge that she had permitted someone to matter more than empire. "You didn't," he said, and he held her as she trembled. This woman who had conquered the universe and found that conquest meant nothing compared to the vulnerability of needing another consciousness to continue existing. Their joining was careful and intense, a negotiation of different physiologies and compatible geometry. It was passionate not because it was rough, but because it contained absolute presence. There were no games of dominance, no power dynamics beyond the decision to allow themselves to be fully known. Afterward, she rested against his chest, her fingers tracing patterns across his skin, and Kenneth understood that she was rewriting the definition of what power meant. She had spent 400 years believing it meant control. She was learning it meant something far more complicated. The political aftermath of the Vrex attack created an opportunity that Tresh and his allies were not slow to exploit. They did not challenge Liabeth's authority directly. Instead, they questioned her judgment through careful procedural mechanisms, through council votes and military restructuring proposals, through whispers to the Allied territories about the dangers of allowing a human to influence imperial strategy. Liabeth recognized the pattern. It was the same strategy she had used to isolate and eliminate her predecessors. And knowing that knowledge of his role in the palace had become a liability only seemed to accelerate Kenneth's acceptance that there was a choice approaching, one that could not be avoided or postponed. He found her in the observation garden, where they had returned countless times over the past weeks, where the boundary between imperial and personal had slowly dissolved. "They're going to force a choice," Kenneth said without preamble. "Either you execute me to prove your authority is independent from me, or you lose the High Command's support, and they replace you with someone more amenable to their control." Liabeth's silence was answer enough. "I can make it easier," Kenneth continued. "I can request asylum, leave the palace voluntarily, tell them I betrayed you, attempted to access secure military data, give them a justification for my removal that doesn't damage your authority." Liabeth's voice was absolute. "I will not survive another 400 years alone because these men fear what I am capable of feeling." "Then there's a third option," Kenneth said, and it cost him something to speak it aloud. "We leave. Together. You abandon the Dominion, and we disappear into the outer territories. Let Tresh have his empire." Liabeth's laugh was bitter and short. I am Empress of the Eternal Dominion. I do not disappear. I do not relinquish power because 9 male commanders became uncomfortable with my choices. So you're going to let them push you into executing me, Kenneth said flatly. You're going to let them win, and I'll be dead. And you'll spend the next 400 years knowing that you sacrificed the only thing that mattered to preserve an authority that was always temporary. And if I do not, Liabeth demanded. If I refuse their ultimatum and insist on keeping you, they execute a coup. My authority is shattered. Every territory watches and calculates whether they should resist as well. The Dominion fractures, billions die in the wars that follow. Or, Kenneth said quietly, they see an Empress who was willing to risk everything to keep one person alive, and they understand that she would risk everything to protect them. That her authority comes from her conviction, not from her fear. Liabeth closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Kenneth could see the weight of centuries pressing against her will. You are asking me to gamble the stability of an entire civilization on the theory that vulnerability might be a form of strength. Yes, Kenneth said simply, I am. The public address was unprecedented. The Empress, in her full ceremonial regalia, appeared before the assembled high command and the diplomatic representatives of every territorial ally. Kenneth stood beside her, not behind, not subordinate, but as an equal presence. Liabeth's voice carried the weight of ancient authority when she spoke. For 400 years I have ruled through fear and conquest. I have eliminated obstacles and obliterated resistance. I have believed that strength required isolation, that survival demanded the elimination of anything that could become a vulnerability. She paused, and her eyes found Kenneth's for just a moment. I have been wrong. The chamber erupted in sound, protests and demands, questions and accusations. But Liabeth continued without acknowledgement of the chaos. The human Kenneth has demonstrated something that no military asset in my arsenal possesses. He has demonstrated that capacity for growth is not weakness, that the willingness to risk personal authority for something larger than oneself is the definition of true leadership. She reached out and took Kenneth's hand, an action that caused the chamber to fragment entirely. I am proposing a restructuring of the Dominion's leadership. The High Command will be reformed to include representatives from all territories, elected by their own populations. My role will transition from unilateral sovereign to elected guardian, subject to council review. Tresh stood. This is institutional suicide. The Empress abdicates her authority. I restructure authority, Liabeth corrected, and if the Dominion cannot survive that restructuring, then it was always fragile enough to warrant replacement. She gestured, and security forces moved into position at every exit, forces that Kenneth had helped coordinate, forces that were prepared to move if the High Command attempted violence. But there was no attempt at coup. There was only the recognition that the Empress had moved the pieces of the game in a way that made their traditional responses obsolete. When the initial shock subsided, the voting began. Most territories voted for restructuring. Some held back, waiting to see if Liabeth's gamble would destabilize her completely. But over the next 72 hours, as the new council structure began to form, as territories recognized the shift from fear-based governance to systems based on representation and accountability, the Dominion began to evolve in ways that Liabeth had never permitted. And the recognition that a human saboteur had been instrumental in that transformation began to shift how humans were perceived throughout the Dominion. Where they had previously been regarded as insignificant, they were suddenly analyzed as a species capable of influencing galactic history. Where they had been treated as tributes, they began to be approached as potential partners. Kenneth stood with Liabeth in the newly restructured command center, watching the political ripples expand outward through the territories, and he saw something in her expression that resembled peace. You gambled, he said quietly. I did, Liabeth agreed, and I won. You could have lost. She turned to face him fully, and the crimson of her skin seemed to glow in the artificial light. 400 years of unilateral control. I was already losing, Kenneth. I was losing myself. She reached out and drew her fingers along his jaw. that gesture that had started this entire transformation. You taught me that the greatest conquest is not of territories or species. It is the conquest of one's own fear. 6 months into the restructured dominion, Kenneth stood in the botanical sector of the palace, a space that had been converted from a trophy room displaying conquered artifacts into something far more alive. Plants from 100 worlds grew in this space, representing territories that had willingly joined the dominion under the new structure rather than submitted to it. Liabeth found him tending to a human plant, something she had discovered he needed, the tactile work of nurturing life from soil and water and sunlight. She wore casual robes now, still elegant, still reflecting her status, but no longer the full ceremonial armor of imperial authority. It was a small change that somehow encompassed the entire shift in who she had become. "The new council from Sector 9 has requested formal alliance," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "They're willing to contribute resources to the expansion program, but they want representation in the Resource Allocation Committee." Kenneth smiled. "Tell them yes. Let them see that negotiation isn't a weakness." "I did," she said, and her tone suggested she found amusement in his assumption that she needed his advice. "I am quite capable of diplomatic negotiation, Kenneth. I spent the last 4 centuries perfecting it." He laughed, and she took his hand, their fingers intertwining in the amber light that filtered through the botanical sector's canopy. The Empress of the Eternal Dominion, the universe's greatest nightmare, leaned her head against his shoulder and felt something that 400 years of conquest had never provided. She felt home. And when Kenneth leaned down to kiss the top of her silver hair, both of them understood that they had fundamentally altered the trajectory of galactic civilization. Not through warfare or conquest, but through the simple act of refusing to accept that power and connection were mutually exclusive. The greatest weapons in the universe, they had learned, were not weapons at all. They were choice. They were vulnerability. They were the willingness to stand before everything you had built and decide that one human, standing without fear, was worth restructuring an entire civilization. Liabeth had spent 400 years being the nightmare. She had spent 6 months learning to be alive. And that transformation, more than any territorial conquest, would define the next era of the Dominion. An era not of fear and subjugation, but of genuine alliance between species. An era that began the moment a Deathworlder from a conquered colony looked into the eyes of the most powerful being in the universe and said, "I'm not scared of you." And she believed him. And in that belief, everything changed. 18 months after the restructuring, the first joint human-Dominion research station orbited the neutral zone between their territories. Kenneth stood in the observation bay, watching stellar cartography teams from 4 different species work alongside engineers from Earth, and he felt something that resembled vindication. The human colonies had transformed in that time. Where they had previously been regarded as negligible resources, they were now recognized as adaptive innovators, a species that could solve problems through lateral thinking rather than direct force. The demand for human technical specialists had created an unprecedented economic expansion, one that lifted settlements out of subsistence and into prosperity. Liabeth entered the observation bay with the quiet efficiency she maintained in all public spaces now. The ceremonial robes were gone. She wore the practical uniform of the Dominion's Leadership Council, tailored to her physiology, but without the elaborate gold embroidery that had once dominated her appearance. Her burgundy horns had been polished to a subtle sheen rather than the dramatic finishes she had previously preferred. The change was not diminishment, it was recalibration. "The Council has voted to approve the expansion initiative," she said without preamble. Kenneth had learned that she maintained this directness in professional settings, reserving the more elaborate communication styles for the time they spent alone. 17 territories have committed resources. The Human Colonial Federation has requested development partnership on 3 additional stations. Kenneth nodded, watching as a human engineer collaborated with a Vrex technical specialist on the stellar mapping protocols. 6 months ago, such cooperation would have been unthinkable. The Vrex collective had attacked the palace, attempted to destabilize Liabeth's authority. Now they were integrated into joint projects, their expertise in gravitational lensing complementing human capabilities in adaptive problem-solving. The Therion collective has sent a delegation, Kenneth said. They want to discuss re-entry into the Dominion. Full membership status, not tributary. Liabeth's expression shifted into something that resembled amusement. The species I dismantled 4 centuries ago wishes to return as equals. This is not coincidence. They watched you restructure your own empire, Kenneth said. They're recognizing that stability built on representation is stronger than stability built on fear. Liabeth moved closer to the viewport, and her reflection ghosted across the transparent aluminum, scarlet skin against the backdrop of stars. I received a message from the Human Council yesterday. They are requesting formal educational exchange programs. They wish to send their young to study in the Imperial academies. And you're going to approve it, Kenneth said. It was not a question. I approved it this morning, she confirmed, but I wanted to discuss the implications with you first. She turned to face him, and her eyes held the weight of decisions that affected billions. If humans become integrated into our academic systems, if they study our political theory and military strategy, if they learn our technological infrastructure, she paused. They could challenge our authority again. In a generation or two, they could possess the knowledge to destabilize what we have rebuilt. Kenneth understood the fear beneath the statement. It was the same fear that had nearly destroyed them months ago, the terror that allowing someone else to possess capability meant accepting the possibility of betrayal. Or, Kenneth said, they could become invested in the system's success. They could understand the Dominion not as an empire to conquer, but as a civilization to contribute to. Fear-based control creates rebels. Investment creates stakeholders. Liabeth's hand found his, and the gesture was automatically intimate. 2 beings who had learned to navigate each other's presence with the precision of long familiarity. You have made me into a philosopher when I was trained to be a conqueror. You were always a philosopher, Kenneth said. You just used military terminology to discuss the same questions. What is power? What creates loyalty? What makes a civilization worth preserving? They stood together watching the observation window, and after several moments of silence, Liabeth spoke again. The Council has also voted on the proposal regarding human representation in the High Strategic Planning Committee. It passed with 60% approval. Kenneth had proposed the measure 2 weeks ago, a formal inclusion of human voices in the decisions that would shape the Dominion's future military and economic development. It was controversial precisely because it was unprecedented. No species outside the original 8 founding territories had been granted such access to strategic planning. Congratulations, Kenneth said. You're genuinely integrating instead of just accommodating. We are creating a vulnerability, Liabeth corrected, but her tone suggested she was reciting objections she no longer entirely believed. The Council will gain access to sensitive information. They could weaponize it. They could, Kenneth agreed, just like you could have executed me the moment you discovered I was a saboteur. Power requires the willingness to trust, and trust requires accepting that betrayal is possible. He turned to face her fully. You're doing what every civilization struggles with, choosing to believe that connection is worth the risk. Liabeth's expression softened into something vulnerable. I was easier when I believed only in conquest. You were lonely, Kenneth said simply. She did not argue. They had long passed the stage of pretending that emotional honesty was equivalent to weakness. Instead, she reached up and drew her fingers along the line of his jaw. That gesture that had become their private language, a signal that meant acceptance and connection, and the acknowledgement that they had fundamentally altered each other's existence. The Council has also requested that we formalize our relationship status, she said, and there was something approximating humor in her voice. They believe public commitment would stabilize political perceptions of our alliance. Kenneth laughed. The Empress of the Eternal Dominion needs council approval to marry a human. Not approval, Liabeth corrected. Recommendation. though I believe I am capable of making autonomous decisions regarding my personal circumstances. She paused. I have already approved the proposal. The ceremony is scheduled for 3 weeks. All territories have been invited? You've scheduled your own wedding, Kenneth said, shaking his head. Incredibly efficient. Should I be concerned that I wasn't consulted? You are being consulted now, she said, and her eyes held absolute certainty. The question is not whether you will marry me. The question is whether you accept the political implications. Your involvement in this transformation will make you a target for those who preferred the old system. Your safety will require security details and restricted movement. You will lose the ability to move through the Dominion anonymously. Kenneth considered this. He had known for months that his role in Liabeth's political restructuring had made him a symbol, first of hope to the territories that feared Dominion conquest, then of stability to those who recognized that the new system was working. The human saboteur who became the Empress's advisor had become something larger than either of them had anticipated. Will you be there? Kenneth asked finally. Every moment, Liabeth said. That is the advantage of marrying the Empress. I control the schedule. He kissed her then, in the observation bay where the stars wheeled above them and the future stretched out like uncharted space, and he understood that they had won something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. Not just the restructuring of an empire or the integration of species or the rewriting of political theory. They had won the right to choose each other every single day, knowing the cost and understanding that the cost was worth it. The Empress had been the universe's greatest nightmare. The human had been trained to destroy her. Instead, they had built something new together, not through conquest or sabotage, but through the simple, radical act of believing that connection was stronger than control. And as the ceremony approached, as the Dominion prepared to witness an unprecedented union, both of them understood that this was only the beginning of a transformation that would ripple across galactic civilization for generations to come. The nightmare had learned to dream, and the Deathworlder had learned to love. Together they would teach the universe what came next.
And that brings us to the end of today's story.